Hello again. This video is going to be about how we can make one of these storage stools. And it may look complicated at first, but I assure you it's not. And what we can do is break it down into a series of much simpler steps, and you can definitely build this. This stool that we're looking at right now is made from untreated cypress, and it's held up pretty well. It's about 3 years old, and as you can imagine, the greenhouse is a pretty inhospitable environment. We get extreme temperatures and a lot of humidity. The build that I'm going to be doing right now will be from cedar, but you could really use any wood that you want. Okay, the first parts that we're going to concern ourselves with are the legs. When we look close at how these legs are constructed, it looks like around 2¼ inches no matter which side we view it from. How we accomplish this effect is actually pretty simple. We just reduce the width of one of our pieces by the thickness of the stock. So let's get started. The material that I'm going to be using for this project is this leftover cedar tongue and groove. So first I will have to square off the edges in order to make my stock. If you already have 3/4 inch stock that's square and already good to go, then you can just jump right in and rip cut the 2¼ inch boards for the legs. The legs will be length cut to 20¼ inches. And keep in mind that all of the measurements that I'm going to give you from here on out will be under the assumption that you're using 3/4 inch thick material. The material that I'm using here has a thickness that's slightly less than 3/4 inch, so I'll have to compensate with my measurements. If the material that you're using is already at 3/4 inch thickness, then you can go right ahead and make this rip cut at 1.5 inches. What's he doing? Yes, you can still do it this way. In my case, I'm using 4-penny finish nails. And that seems like a pretty reasonable choice to me, because that leaves us with just a little bit more of the nail on this side than on this side. Move from one side to the other as you nail, and that way you'll still be free to adjust the unfastened side until it's flush. Also, stay back about 1.5 inches here from your ends, and you'll see why in a little bit. You can make the tip of a nail less wedge-like, and thus less likely to split by flattening it a little bit on something hard. Here, I'll give you a better look. And I also have pneumatic fasteners that are about the same length. Well, that does it for the legs, so let's move on to the rest of the frame. All that really remains to the frame is to construct these 3 squares. See? I told you that it wasn't too complicated. Each of these squares is just 12 by 12, and the legs fasten right to them. at 1 3/4 inches, the bottom square is the widest, so let's do it first. Just as a general rule, I like to cut longer or wider pieces first if I'm given a choice. My thinking behind this is that if I screw up a bigger piece, I can still salvage much of the material if I can get a smaller piece out of it. But of course this doesn't work the other way around. So, after ripping enough for the 4 sides, we cut 2 of them to 12 inches, and then we can use those to figure out the length for the other 2 sides, which should be around about 10.5 inches. Next, we set the saw to 1 3/8 for the remaining 2 squares, and we just repeat the same procedure. Just as a side note, cedar is just an absolute pleasure to work with. It cuts really easily, and it has such a pleasant smell. The whole garage actually smells like it right now while I'm filming this, and I don't even want to sweep up the sawdust. So I recommend that you use it for this project. It's also extremely resistant to the elements, but probably the best reason to use it for this stool is because of how lightweight it is. For the top and the bottom squares, 1 trim nail in the middle is all that we need for now. If you do use more than one, the nails could be in the way of the screws that we put in the next step. This doesn't apply to the middle square, because the screw that holds it to the legs is out of the way. I'm going to use 2 screws to attach each leg, and the screws are going to crisscross one another this way, hopefully without hitting each other. I'm going to use galvanized fasteners for this. Compare that to a normal drywall screw, and you can see the color difference. This silvery color is the result of dipping it in a zinc bath. It makes it slightly more resistant to corrosion. Now, it is possible that the cedar wood could react with the galvanized fasteners, so here's your disclaimer. Drilling a pilot hole is usually always a good idea when you're using screws. It prevents the wood from splitting, and it makes it much easier to fasten the 2 pieces together. I would like this middle square to be 9 inches up from the bottom. So I used some scrap to cut some sticks that will help ensure that. After I'm finished fastening the top together, we can start working on these slats. And they will go on the middle square and on the sides. except a little bit neater than that. The stock that we'll have to make for these slats will come in two lengths. Here's one, and here's the other length. The width will be the same as these top two squares on our frame, and as for the thickness, we're just going to rip a piece of stock in half and get two out of one. There's really no reason to be intimidated by this procedure, and as with most things, there are multiple ways that we can go about solving this problem. You could adjust the height on the table saw blade and take the entire width of the stock in one pass, but just to reduce risk a little bit, we'll go half at a time. It can be a little bit tricky to cut exactly in the center so that both pieces are of the same thickness. So the best advice that I can give you is to just take a little bit of a kiss out of it right here and then flip it upside down. And now just use your eye. This method will reveal even the tiniest size discrepancy between the two pieces. Alright, I've now cut 20 slats for around the sides, and I've cut 7 slats for the bottom of the storage compartment. I also made this spacer block, and it will help me to determine exactly where the center is for my middle slat. And this is very important because since there's an odd number of slats on each face, the center one determines the layout. So the center is defining where the middle one has to go, and the end one goes where it has to go, which is just flush up against the edge of that leg. So that really only leaves us with the middle two to space correctly. I'm just doing the spacing by eye because there's really not that much at stake here. But you can certainly measure if you aren't comfortable with it. In general, I think I try to approach all problems this way. I do the things that I know that I can do first without screwing anything up. Then, once you see what's left to do after that, it's rarely the case, if ever, that the problem seems as complicated as it did at first. Remember, anything that can be made can be reduced to a series of simpler steps. Not bad so far. Let me show you one of my favorite features. And finally, we've come to the lid. The lid's frame is just another square made out of 1 3/8 stock, but I added about a ½ centimeter of play in both directions, just to make it a little bit easier to get on and off. At this point, I'm laying out my top surface, and while I'm doing it, I'm considering aesthetics. I want to think about these knots and features and dark regions and such, so as to not put too much negative space in any one region. And speaking of regions, I'm putting smooth side up on the seat so that we don't get any splinters in any tender regions. I've sized all of my top boards so that I would have about a 3/16 gap in between each one, and after the gap it still gives me about an eighth of an inch over the square in both directions. I would prefer it if I didn't see any fasteners on my top, so I'm going to attach my top boards by screwing from underneath, and that leaves me with a small problem that has an easy fix. And there it is. I hope that you found this both interesting and useful, and if you plan on making one of these, by all means, please let me know in the comments. I would love to hear from you.